Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 6. I'm so proud of your progress. I know that we've covered a lot so far. We've covered Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and now we start a new unit. We have a lot to consider post-Exam 1, right? And this unit includes two chapters that are really foundational: learning in Chapter 6 and memory in Chapter 7. And you're going to see that these two chapters together have a lot to say about the behaviorist and cognitive approaches in psychology. All of the approaches in this chapter are part of a particular tradition in psychology called behaviorism. However, it's important to remember that the behaviorist approach is not the only approach in regard to the study of learning. And you'll see how the behaviorist approach and then the later cognitive approach have developed in tandem and developed because of one another's influence. So let's get started. So what would be a good thing to keep in mind over this chapter? Well, I think it's very salient to all of us, having just taken an exam, that the learning and learning process and learning and memory process are not as simple as we would suspect. You guys are in college, you're taking lots of exams, maybe even exams this week, and you know that the process of acquiring information and maintaining information and responding to information is inherently human and inherently complex. So what I'd like you to think about as I talk about Chapter 6 topics is I'd like you to think about your own learning processes, your own ways of learning. You can think about ways that would improve your learning and memory. Now, there's going to be a lot of terminology that you have to learn in this chapter. Don't get bogged down on it. Just focus on the big picture, which is that we're just trying to study how humans and animals, how do they learn to respond to the world around them? And by application, how can you take some of these insights from classic psychology in learning and make yourself a better, more effective student? So in this chapter, we're going to walk through two main branches of learning. We're going to talk about associative learning, which is both classical conditioning and operant conditioning, as well as observational learning, or learning from the vicarious experience of watching somebody else do something. Throughout the chapter, we're going to talk about factors that influence and affect that learning process. And the end of your chapter has some insights from the literature in regard to health and wellness, especially focused on how to deal with stress. So what is learning? Well, learning is when you learn something, right? The definition basically defines itself. So let's get a little bit more specific here. Learning is a systematic, relatively permanent, that means like durable, change in behavior that occurs through experience. And what a behaviorist means by experience involves stuff like exposure, practice, and repetition. So learning is a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. Let's walk this back for a second. We know that we come to the world with instincts and reflexes. Reflexes are motor or neural or action-based responses to specific stimuli in the environment. They tend to be simpler than instincts and involve specific body parts and systems. They usually involve more primitive centers of the central nervous system, and reflexes are unlearned. You don't have to learn to blink your eye when something's coming at it. In contrast, instincts are more innate behaviors that are triggered by a broader range of events, such as maturation, certain food situations, or even the change of seasons. They're more complex patterns of behavior, and they involve more of an integration of a creature's behavior. It's no surprise then that instincts involve higher level centers in the brain. Both reflexes and instincts do not need to be learned. But unlike instincts and reflexes, learned behaviors involve change and experience. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience, exposure, practice, repetition. The study of learning is often housed within the behaviorist approach, and the behaviorist approach has had tremendous influence on the field of psychology. To the behaviorist, what's important to study are observable behaviors. So behaviorists weren't really focused at all on mental processes or things that could not be objectively measured and watched. So I can watch objectively how many times my cat presses the door trying to look for the crunchy bag. But I can't really measure the thought processes going through my cat's brain at the time that they're looking for the crunchies. One of the simplest connections of learning that we study has to do with something called associative learning. And associative learning occurs when an organism makes connections between certain stimuli and events that occur together in the environment. So you're going to see that this type of learning, the learning of associations, it's going to be connected to classical conditioning, which has to do with unconscious processes and associations. Operant conditioning, which has to do with conscious processes and rewards and punishments. And our other type of learning, observational learning, which will add social, cultural, cognitive, and biological layers to all of these basic associative learning processes, both conscious and unconscious. Now, within associative learning, we have two main types of associative learning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is a process by which we learn to associate stimuli with one another. And consequently, when we learn to associate stimuli with one another, we learn to anticipate events. So in this example here on the slide, we have a doctor's office, and then we have receiving a shot. And so when a child learns that the doctor's office is the same place that you get that hurtful shot, and it was kind of scary, you learn to associate the doctor's office with the fear response in the same way that you have the fear response when you receive a shot. What's being associated here is the doctor's office with the fear response of getting a shot. Classical conditioning does best to explain involuntary behavior, things like responding to food, being hungry, being satiated by thirst, fear, or positive emotion as well, just involuntary either positive or negative responses. So that response, the fear to getting a shot, is being shifted to a new stimulus, that is the office in which a shot takes place. The association then between the doctor's office and the shot fear is being learned. So in classical conditioning, we learn the association between stimuli, especially when there's anticipated connections between stimuli. In our next type of associative learning, we have operant conditioning. This term operant conditioning comes to us by way of B.F. Skinner. And operant conditioning helps to explain a different type of behavior. Classical conditioning explains involuntary behaviors, fear responses, food and drink responses, positive emotional responses, more instinctual, more innate and reflexive responses. For operant conditioning, what's being learned is the consequence of certain behaviors. Therefore, operant conditioning better explains how we learn to do more voluntary, higher order behaviors. So in this example, we have a swim competition. So we have a girl and she's training and she's swimming. That's the behavior. And we have an outcome. So she's gotten an award. Awesome. That's a positive consequence, a reward of the behavior that she's done. In this example, she's going to swim more, train more, and put more time into the swimming behavior on account of the positive consequence. In both classical and operant conditioning, conditioning means that we are learning associations. In classical conditioning, we're learning associations among stimuli. And in operant conditioning, we're learning associations between a behavior and essentially a consequence or an outcome. All right, so let's get a little bit more specific about classical conditioning. So as you remember, classical conditioning is an associative learning type. In classical conditioning, a neutral stimulus is becoming associated with a meaningful stimulus and acquiring the power to produce a response. This conditioning is not just happening once, but dozens and dozens of times. As the animal learns an association between a stimulus that was formerly neutral, but has now become meaningful because of its association with a meaningful stimulus. So let me walk through this a little bit here. In order to explain classical conditioning, we have to tell the story of Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, and he was studying the digestion of dogs. He had a little bit of a problem because in his studies, when he's trying to give this meat powder to his dogs, the dogs are starting to drool and starting to digest and starting to have this salivation reflex before the food or meat powder is even presented to them. So whether it's the sound of footsteps of the scientist approaching the booth where the dogs were, or it's a door opening on the way to the lab, or it's the sound of an experimenter's voice, something is interrupting his data. Something is interrupting him being able to study the salivation reflex. Something is interrupting his ability to study the salivation response. So in his studies with dogs, he's trying to measure the amount of saliva produced in response to various foods. Over time, Pavlov is learning that the dogs begin to salivate and drool not only at the taste of the meat powder or food, but also at the sight of the food, at the sight of an empty food bowl, or even the sound of his lab assistant's footsteps on the way to the dogs. Salivating to the food when it's placed in their mouth, that's a reflex. No learning is required. So Pavlov is wondering, why are the dogs responding this way? They're responding before I've even presented food. So he designs a series of carefully controlled experiments to see which stimuli would cause the dogs to actually salivate. He was able to train the dogs to drool in response to stimuli that clearly had nothing to do with food, such as the sound of a bell, or even a light, or a touch on the leg. Through his experiments, Pavlov realized that his dogs had two types of responses to the environment: unlearned, unconditioned responses, and learned or conditioned responses. So let's talk about what happens before conditioning and before learning is taking place. Before learning, we have unconditioned state. We have an unlearned state. In the unlearned state, you're essentially going to have reflexive response to the world. So here on this slide, you can see that the unconditioned response, this is the unlearned response, involves food being presented to a dog. In its natural state, unlearned state, unconditioned state, the unconditioned stimulus is food. You don't need to teach a dog to salivate to food. That's a reflex. It comes inbuilt. So before conditioning, we have the unconditioned stimulus, which is food, leading to the unconditioned response, which is the dog salivating. All right, so we have before conditioning and before learning is taking place, we have a neutral stimulus. In this example on this slide, you'll see that there is the sound of a bell. Now, this sound of a bell, before learning any association with food, just the sound of a bell is not going to make a dog drool. You could ring many different bell sounds and a dog is not going to drool to that. He has no innate physiological response to the sound of a bell, meaning anything for his salivation. So in classical conditioning, that neutral stimulus of the bell, it's going to be presented immediately before the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. So Pavlov would sound that bell and then give the dogs the meat powder or the food. That tone, that bell, is the neutral stimulus, and it doesn't naturally elicit response. But when the dogs are conditioned, again, not merely once, but dozens of times, when Pavlov paired the bell tone with the food over and over again, the previously neutral stimulus, that bell, also begins to elicit salivation. That neutral stimulus of the bell becomes a conditioned or learned stimulus, which is a stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. This means that eventually the dogs begin to salivate to the bell alone, just as they previously salivated at the presentation of food. The behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, is called the conditioned response. They had learned to associate the conditioned stimulus with being fed and therefore begin to salivate in response to the bell tone. The process of learning this association is called acquisition. It is the learning of the connection between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, that pairing. So let's walk through this one more time so you understand this. And I know that this slide has a lot on it. So don't get overwhelmed. We just have basically 4 terms that you need to learn: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. And once you learn exactly what those things mean, every example becomes a little bit easier to apprehend. Okay, so let's walk this through again. Food is an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to teach a dog to drool in response to food. It's unlearned. There is an innate stimulus-response association. Food by itself is such an important stimulus, such an innate, instinctual, reflexive, important stimulus, that it is unlearned in the sense that you don't have to teach a dog to respond to that stimulus. So food for a dog is an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to teach it what it is. Its body knows and responds to food, that food is good. And if you've been around a dog, you totally understand. They'll eat almost anything, right? They're like, is that food? That's awesome. Let's do that. Food for a dog and for creatures in general is an unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to teach its value. Therefore, you don't have to teach what to do with food. The unlearned reflex is called the unconditioned response, or UCR. So food as the stimulus is unconditioned stimulus. You don't have to teach it. Drooling in response to food is an unconditioned response. You don't have to learn how to respond to food. It is unlearned. On the other side of this slide, you'll see that we have a sound. This is another type of stimulus. Let's imagine a bell ringing, a doorbell ringing. Ding dong. The bell doesn't mean anything in regard to biological or innate associations. There is no response to the sound of a bell other than just being aware of it. So if you ring a doorbell around a dog will notice it, it can hear it, but it's not going to start drooling to it. So the sound of the bell is a neutral stimulus at first. At first, it has absolutely sort of no biological or innate response. But when you pair both stimuli here, the sound is a stimulus and the food is a stimulus, when you repeatedly condition or pair them together, what's being learned and conditioned is that sound is predictive of or associated with food. So when sound becomes paired with food, we call this a learned or conditioned stimulus. When the sound is paired with food, it now gets called a conditioned stimulus. And we don't do this just once, we do this repeatedly. And when we do this repeatedly, what's being learned is the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So what's being learned essentially here is the connection and the predictive connection between the conditioned stimulus, the sound of the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, the food. Over repeated pairings, what will happen is the animal will learn that the conditioned stimulus pretty much means the same thing as the unconditioned stimulus, Therefore, it can respond with a learned response, and it will drool in response to the conditioned stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is that previously neutral stimulus that eventually will elicit a conditioned response when it's paired over and over with the unconditioned stimulus. And the conditioned response or learned response is learning to respond to the conditioned stimulus the same way you would respond to the unconditioned stimulus. And as an animal learns the association between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, we're saying that they are going through acquisition. They are learning the connection between conditioned and unconditioned stimuli. And that's exactly what classical conditioning is, the learned association between stimuli. In order for an animal to acquire this learning, this associative learning, there's two key things that have to happen: contiguity and contingency. So let's talk about both of these. Contiguity means that there is a close time connection between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So you can't teach these dogs or condition these dogs to drool to the sound of a bell if the bell takes place 30 minutes before the food arrives. They might eventually pick up on some aspects of it or just get smart if there's some other cues in the environment about what's going on. But learning the association is the strongest and the quickest and the most connected when the proximity of time is close between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. Ring the bell, immediately present the food. It needs to happen close in time. Contiguity. The other factor here is contingency. Contingency has to do with the conditioned stimulus reliably and regularly preceding that unconditioned stimulus. So it's giving reliable, specific, predictive power to the animal to know that the sound of the bell happens before the presentation of food. And I know that because the food's presentation is contingent on the bell sounding. So contingency has to do with predictive power or preceding power. The conditioned stimulus will precede the unconditioned stimulus. Said another way, the unconditioned stimulus will follow the conditioned stimulus. Bell to food, bell to food. Okay, so I know that's a lot to take in, but let's make it as simple as it can be. In order for you to learn the association between something that was previously neutral and now has taken on meaning, you need to have contiguity, which is closeness in time, and contingency, which means there's a reliable, specific, predictive power of the conditioned or learned stimulus preceding and being connected with the unconditioned stimulus. Contiguity has to do with time and proximity in time, and contingency has to do with predictive connection. Okay, let's connect to our next slide, which has to do with Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study. John B. Watson is considered the founder of behaviorism. Behaviorism is a school of thought that arose during the first part of the 20th century, which incorporates elements of Pavlov's classical conditioning. Watson championed the idea that all behavior can be studied as a simple stimulus-response reaction, without any regard for internal mental processes. Watson argued that in order for psychology to become a legitimate science, it had to shift its concern away from these inside mental processes because those mental processes couldn't be seen or measured. Therefore, they could be somewhat subjective or biased. Instead, he asserted that psychology has to focus on what we can observe and what we can measure. According to Watson, human behavior, just like animal behavior, is a result of conditioned responses. Watson believed that the same principles could extend to the conditioning of emotions. So John Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, they started doing some experiments with a 9-month-old baby called little Albert. These studies demonstrate how fear can be conditioned. So through these experiments, essentially little Albert was exposed to different stimuli. Initially, he's presented with various neutral stimuli, including a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, some masks, some cotton wool, and a white rat. He's not afraid. The baby was not initially afraid of any of these things. But then Watson, with the help of Rayner, conditioned little Albert to associate these stimuli with an emotion, fear. Watson would put a little rabbit, and I have a picture on your slide that you can see there, put a rabbit in front of little Albert. Little Albert at first was not afraid of the rabbit, but Watson would present the rabbit and then bang a really loud noise behind the baby's head. Babies don't like that. It's an unconditioned stimulus. It scares them. You don't have to teach a baby to be afraid of an unpredictable loud sound behind their head. It's an unlearned reflex. It's unconditioned that you would cry or be afraid of a loud, unpredictable sound. So in this conditioning, the loud sound is an unconditioned stimulus. Crying to the loud sound is the unconditioned response. So what little Albert was learning was that the rabbit and the loud sound equal fear, and the association between the rabbit and fear become the conditioned stimulus, rabbit, and conditioned response, fear to the sight of the rabbit. Even when you take the loud noise away, little Albert was still afraid of the rabbit. He had been conditioned. He had learned the association between the conditioned stimulus, rabbit, and unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise. Now, something that was noticeable for little Albert was a principle called generalization. Generalization is the tendency of a new stimulus, similar to the original conditioned stimulus, to also elicit that conditioned response or that conditioned behavior. So when little Albert was afraid of beards and blankets and fur coats, he was generalizing the fear response from the rabbit to just furry objects. Now, when I originally learned about this study in Psych 101 at UC Riverside, I don't think I really had an appreciation for how highly unethical this study was. It was like, okay, well, you can conditioning works for humans too. Teaching a little baby to be afraid of something and it generalizes could have very large implications. Now, in fact, there are disputes about the outcome for little Albert. There's some researchers in the early 2010s that believe they found little Albert and unfortunately found that he had died around the age of 6 or 7. However, other researchers have placed little Albert on a different person, a person that lived a very long life, and he died at 87. The grand niece of this person said that he was afraid of dogs his whole life and didn't really like them, otherwise didn't have any major problems. I don't know the outcome of little Albert. I don't know which child, because he was confidential in the study. We don't know exactly the identity of little Albert. This is to say, I just want to intervene and say that we would not do this research now. This would not be something that would be executed in this manner. What does it mean for us, though? Well, the insights of Watson's little Albert study show us that fear can be conditioned and that humans can be conditioned. There's many different places in which classical conditioning is used in order to teach or associate certain stimuli with certain other stimuli. Your book talks about classical conditioning in marketing. So you'll see that a product which is formerly neutral, when it's repeatedly paired with an unconditioned stimulus of very beautiful, very happy, very connected, very desirous actors, we get to learn that product equals positive emotions. So the positive associations between these gorgeous, super happy, desirous actors having a really good time become associated with the product that they're shown being around or using. Therefore, the association that we're learning is between a positive emotion and a product. Therefore, advertisements are teaching us to associate their product with positive feelings. Your book also talks about a complicated tolerance for medication loop that I think is really interesting. So in this, what we're seeing is that through classical conditioning, the sight or act of taking a pill with medicine in it soon comes to elicit the same pain relief as the medicine itself produces. So in the placebo effect, you have essentially a sugar pill. We'll call that the neutral stimulus. And you have an unconditioned stimulus, which is a pill that has medicine in it. So let's imagine I have an unconditioned stimulus that is 2 Tylenol tablets. And I have a neutral stimulus, which is 2 Tic Tacs, 2 breath mints. They don't have any medicine or any Tylenol or any pain reliever in them. When the Tylenol, the unconditioned stimulus, relieves pain, and my body has an unconditioned and unlearned response to the actual pain medicine, I don't need to learn to respond to medicine in my body. Medicine in my body releases endorphins, and the endorphins bring some pain relief. But if I was part of a drug study, or I was being manipulated in some way, and I was being given Tic Tacs instead of Tylenol, and I was being told that the Tic Tacs had medicine in them, the Tic Tacs, or the breath mints, they become a conditioned stimulus, especially when they become paired with my knowledge and expectation of how medicine works. So the placebo effect is when I have a reduce in pain symptoms and I have pain relief to a sugar pill or a placebo, my body has learned the association between the conditioned stimulus, that's the sugar pill, and the real stimulus or the real medicine, the unconditioned stimulus. And I've learned my body responds with the conditioned response, which is that the sugar pill can actually make me feel better. In this case of the placebo effect, the pill, the sugar pill, the placebo, is the conditioned stimulus. And that repeated pairing that's happening, that's my experience with Tylenol. It's my experience with pain-relieving medicine. As long as I know that, oh, I take a little pill and it looks like this and my body feels better, every time I do that, the association between conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, they connect with one another. I learn the association between taking pills and pain relief. That is a learned association. The placebo effect. Even immune response and endocrine response can show classical conditioning, which I think is so interesting. Your basic immunofunction and endocrine function can be classically conditioned. Your biology can be altered in response to the experiences that you have with conditioned stimuli. So to review on the placebo effect. In the placebo effect, through classical conditioning, the sight of or even the act of taking a pill soon comes to elicit the same pain relief as does the actual medicine in the pill itself. Whether or not there is a pill that has medicine in it or it's a placebo that you just expect to have medicine in it. Your book also talks about drug tolerance, habituation, and overdose. So what's happening here with drug habituation is that there's a decreased responsiveness to a stimulus after repeated presentations. So the context of drug taking is serving as a conditioned stimulus. That conditioned stimulus is giving the body a cue for and a preparation for impact of the drug. So that conditioned stimulus is basically preparing and prompting the body to respond to the drug. So the body is naturally protecting itself by attempting to neutralize the effects of the drugs that are on their way. And that's an unlearned reflex. So let's talk about this. Let's say that someone is taking opiates and they take them pretty regularly. They do it in a certain way with certain lighting at a certain time. There's a certain way of doing it. The effect of those opiates in their body, you don't have to teach the body to respond to opiates. Opiates and opium, they are related to endorphins. They impact that system. So the unconditioned stimulus has to do with that endorphin system, that system response. You don't have to teach your body to respond to painkillers in that way. You also don't have to learn that your body often braces for certain drugs by counteracting them or trying to balance them or trying to be careful with them. That your body has natural neutralizing effects, especially of very strong drugs. That's something that is unlearned. It is the unconditioned response. If a person consistently takes drugs, maybe in a certain way, in a certain time, in a certain location, that paraphernalia and that context become a conditioned stimulus. Through classical conditioning, the body learns to anticipate the drug in the presence of that drug context or drug paraphernalia. And your body begins neutralizing the drug before it's even taken. Thus, the body has to take even more of the drug to get the same effect because of those repeated pairings between context and drug effect. This is how classical conditioning can create drug tolerance. It's also why simply seeing drug paraphernalia or drug situations or the places and times and context of drug use can trigger withdrawal symptoms and even cravings for people that take drugs. The body's complicated response, but also classically conditioned response to drug use and drug context. Another special classical conditioning feature that we want to talk about before we move on is something called one trial learning or taste aversion. Unlike conventional classical conditioning, taste aversion can occur under very impoverished learning conditions. In particular, a powerful taste aversion can be learned with just one exposure, rather than the dozens and dozens that we've seen in other learning scenarios. And this one exposure happens where the unconditioned response does not occur for several hours instead of within proximity or contiguity, closeness in time. One trial learning is considered a counterexample to Pavlov's theory, and it shows that not all stimulus-response associations stand on equal footing. Some associations, like taste aversion, are biologically primed, or as we call them, biologically prepared. So let me give you an example of taste aversion so you can see how it's a unique example of classical conditioning. Okay, why is it unique? It's unique because you only need one time. It's also unique because that unconditioned response doesn't have to happen immediately. The responding time can have a lag. So being sick biologically, having something wrong, let's call it food poisoning, you don't have to teach the body that illness is an unconditioned stimulus, and you don't have to teach them that when they have bacteria in their stomach or some poison features in their body, that their body is going to feel gross, that there's going to be nausea. Illness, in the case of like food poisoning, unconditioned stimulus, and nausea in response to illness, an unconditioned response. You don't have to teach that reflex. Your body knows that one. Well, let's imagine that you've gone to a new restaurant and you've had fettuccine alfredo. If there was something wrong in the dairy or in the presentation or the preparation of the fettuccine alfredo, and that fettuccine alfredo made you sick, you could learn to avoid or be aversive to fettuccine alfredo. You could learn it just that one time, especially if the nausea was extreme. And you could even learn that association even if you got sick 14 hours later. even if it was later in time. It doesn't even have to be right after eating it. It could be much, much later where your body goes, oh, that connects with nausea. So the conditioned stimulus in this example is a bad batch of fettuccine Alfredo. And the nausea to fettuccine Alfredo, you have learned a taste aversion, classical conditioning 1 trial learning. You've learned the association between fettuccine Alfredo and illness. Farmers and ranchers can sometimes use this to keep coyote and wolf packs from attacking their either sheep or their cattle and stuff. What they'll do is essentially lace meat of some variety with a substance that makes the coyotes or wolves become very, very sick. It doesn't kill them, it just makes them really, really sick. So essentially that they show this taste aversion response, therefore avoiding the sheep or avoiding the cattle when given the opportunity. So let's now turn to a couple other terms in classical conditioning that you should understand: generalization and discrimination. So let's talk about generalization. As I've mentioned before, generalization is the tendency of a stimulus that is similar to the original conditioned stimulus to also elicit the conditioned response. If I have had 1 trial learning and I have learned that fettuccine Alfredo equals being sick, generalization would be me also learning or also feeling sick to any pastas or anything like fettuccine Alfredo, like macaroni and cheese. Macaroni and cheese is similar to fettuccine Alfredo. They're both white sauces or could be white sauces. They both involve noodles, but they're not the same thing, right? But they're similar enough. So if I respond in the same way to mac and cheese as I respond to fettuccine Alfredo, I have generalized the response. The association has generalized. Another example might be when a little baby learns that dad is like dada, she sometimes sees other men and calls them dada too. So she's generalizing the response dada to other similar sort of male targets. Like, dada, you must be him, right? You're similar. Generalization is her broadening out her response to stimuli that are like her dad. But what's discrimination then? Discrimination goes in the opposite direction. Discrimination has to do with specificity. So what's being learned here is a specific CS-CR connection. A specific conditioned stimulus elicits a specific conditioned response. And others that are similar to the CS do not promote that response. So in my example of a little baby saying dada to other men, she's generalized that dada response to other men. She can learn to discriminate when those other men don't respond to her with, yeah, I am, hello, good job, right? So when she doesn't get the praise from other men and she only gets specific praise and good feelings and connections and claps and smiles from her actual dad, when she learns that that person and that person only is dada, that sound and that man's face, they have to go together. They're the only ones that go together. She has learned to discriminate who dad is, and therefore the connection is specific between the conditioned stimulus and her conditioned response. Eventually, what's being learned is a specific connection between the conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. Well, good job, you guys. We're about halfway through the lecture and you've learned about classical conditioning. We're going to move on to the other type of associative learning in this chapter, and that has to do with operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, creatures learn to associate a behavior and its consequences. So classical conditioning had to do with involuntary behaviors and learning associations between stimuli. In classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, And that neutral stimulus eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus, which brings about the conditioned response. That stimulus occurs immediately before the response. That's the stimulus timing of classical conditioning. So in operant conditioning, the target behavior is going to be followed either by a reinforcement or punishment. And what the animal is learning essentially is the connection between their behavior and the outcome or the consequence. That reinforcement or punishment occurs after they've responded. Therefore, operant conditioning better explains voluntary behaviors. And what we're going to see is that the consequences of a behavior, whether it's rewarded or punished, are going to change the probability of that behavior's occurrence. Things that are rewarded are becoming more likely to occur in the future, and things that are punished should, by this understanding in operant conditioning, should be less likely to occur in the future. We owe a lot to the understanding of operant conditioning to Thorndike. And this researcher, Thorndike, has a term called the law of effect. The law of effect is essentially what I've just said, that behaviors that are followed by positive outcomes are strengthened, and behaviors followed by negative outcomes are weakened or less likely. So a positive consequence strengthens a stimulus-response connection, and a negative consequence weakens a stimulus-response connection. Thorndike did these studies with the puzzle box. He put cats in this configuration. There's a picture here on this slide. And in order for the cat to get the food which is outside of the puzzle box, what they need to do is figure out how to press that lever, because the lever would open the door, and when the door is open, they could step out and eat. Well, cats are adorable, but it takes them a long time to sometimes figure out what to do. So they meow, they try to stick their paw out, they try to rub against the bars, they try to bite the bars, they scratch at different places. Eventually, they figure out that they can touch that lever and the door opens and there's the food. If you move the lever, they sort of have to learn it over again, but they can learn when they're rewarded with food. Oh, the lever goes with the food. So the consequence of getting the food after pressing the lever strengthens their desire and probability to press the lever. They press it more frequently when they're rewarded with food for doing so. Another really important psychologist is B.F. Skinner, and he's going to expand on this classic work, this work of stimulus-response connections. Skinner's idea that learning is the result of consequences is based on that law of effect by Thorndike. To repeat, the law of effect is that behaviors that are followed by consequences that are satisfying to the creature are more likely to be repeated, and behaviors that are followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. Essentially, if an organism does something that brings about a desired result, the organism is more likely to do that same behavior again. Working with Thorndike's law of effect as his foundation, Skinner began conducting scientific experiments on usually rats and pigeons to determine how these animals can learn through operant conditioning. He developed an operant conditioning chamber for the systematic study of how behaviors are either strengthened or weakened according to their consequences. He placed these animals inside an operant conditioning chamber, which has come to be known as the Skinner box. The Skinner box either has a lever for the rats or a little disc for pigeons, and the animal can either press the lever or peck the disc for food via a dispenser. Speakers and lights can be associated with certain behaviors, and a recorder can objectively count the number of responses made by the animal. One of the cool things about the Skinner box, you guys, is that he wanted to make it soundproof so that there couldn't be any associations or Pavlovian outside responses where the pigeons are hearing the experimenter come, and they learn that when the experimenter comes, that means food. So he was really, really trying to study learning as scientifically as possible, as precisely as possible. We can credit Skinner also with the idea of shaping, or essentially rewarding animals as they get closer and closer to the desired behavior. During World War II, Skinner actually worked on a program called Project Pigeon. And it was an experimental project trying to use pigeons to guide missiles. The pigeons were trained by Skinner to peck at a target, and they were rewarded with food when they completed the task correctly. Skinner designed a missile that actually carried pigeons, which could see the target through the windows. The pigeons would peck at the target. Pecking in turn would control the missile's tail fins, keeping it on course, and essentially transmitting the force of the pecking to the missile's guidance system. The pigeon's accuracy was nearly perfect, according to preliminary testing. As part of the training, Skinner also put the pigeons through psychological fitness tests where he had loud noises and lights and moved the box around and shook it around so that they were exposed to G-forces meant to simulate real-life combat. Now, the military didn't actually use the project because they actually developed guidance systems anyway, but it's a really neat thing to consider that Skinner was trying to teach animals how to do precise activities. And for our purposes, we're going to understand shaping as the process of learning to do something new and complex. Now, you could wait around for a long time to train a cat to use the toilet as their litter box, but you'd be waiting a long time to reinforce that behavior. You have to, if you're teaching an animal something complex, you actually have to reward them by shaping. When they get closer to the behavior, you give them rewards. So in some of the studies that Skinner did, when Skinner was trying to teach his rats where the lever was, or that the lever meant food, rats didn't just learn immediately that the lever meant food. Sometimes he had to give them food if they were on that side of the box. Like, look, come over here. They were getting shaped or rewarded for getting closer to the behavior. And sometimes the food would be right on the lever. So if they got a little bit closer to the lever, they realized, okay, this is the area where reinforcement is. And eventually, when they touch the lever, or they actually do the specific behavior, then the reward becomes specific to that action. So shaping is where you get rewards in the direction of the desired final behavior. Shaping is how dolphin trainers train dolphins. It's how they train animals for movies and commercials. I mentioned training a cat to use a toilet as its cat box. When I was a graduate student in psychology, I had a research assistant who had trained his cat to do this. So it is possible. So any training that involves a complex behavior is going to involve shaping, and shaping is using rewards in the direction of that behavior. All right, so let's move forward and talk about reinforcement. Reinforcement or reward is a consequence that increases the likelihood of a behavior occurring. There are two types of reinforcement: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Now, I want you to remember here, because oftentimes students will get confused about these words positive and negative. Reinforcement is reward. So when you see the word reinforcement, you're going to know that reinforcement increases the likelihood of the animal, the creature, the human doing that behavior. Positive and negative in this sense don't mean good or bad. Positive means adding something in, and negative means subtracting something out. So let's walk through that. So positive reinforcement is probably what you think about when you think about reward. Positive reinforcement is that behavior is followed by a rewarding consequence. A rewarding stimulus is added in. It's positive. It's added in. So when you clap and give yay to a baby that's standing up, you're adding praise. When you give a piece of candy to a kid for doing their homework, you're adding a piece of candy. So you are adding positive reinforcement, adding a reward. Negative reinforcement is also a rewarding stimulus. It's a reward. So negative reinforcement means that you're taking something negative away, which therefore is a reward. So in negative reinforcement, just like positive reinforcement, your behavior is followed by a rewarding consequence. In this case, though, the rewarding consequence means that something painful or something unpleasant has been taken away. So if you take a Tylenol and your headache stops, that's good, right? So you're taking away a painful headache. So the next time you have a headache, you become more likely to take the Tylenol because you remember, when I took the Tylenol, the headache went away. So that was a good thing. I was removing something that was unpleasant. So again, positive here means something is added, and negative means something is removed. And since it's reinforcement, that reinforcement, whether positive or negative, results in me behaving more in that direction. Okay, so we have an example here of turning in homework on time. So in regard to reinforcement, let's imagine that the behavior is submitting your homework assignment on time in Canvas. You're doing it on time, it's not late. Positive reinforcement could be the addition of me praising you. Good job, you guys. You're on track. You're doing so well. This is awesome. I'm adding praise. And praise is good. Praise makes us feel good. Nice. We like to know that we're doing a good job. So positive reinforcement is the addition of something positive. The addition of something positive should increase the likelihood of you turning in the homework on time. It should increase the behavior frequency and likelihood. Negative reinforcement could be the removal of constant emails from me or constant nagging that's like, hey guys, don't forget your homework. Hey guys, submit your homework. Hey, I need you to turn in your homework. So when you turn in your homework on time and the emails and reminders and hey, don't forget, when that is removed, it's reinforcing because it feels good to have that removed. Therefore, it becomes more likely for you to turn your homework in on time. In the positive reinforcement case, you are doing homework turning in on time because you're adding a reward of praise. And in the case of negative reinforcement, you're turning the homework in on time to remove an unpleasant constant nag or reminder. So your book talks about a special kind of negative reinforcement, and this is something called avoidance learning. It's where you learn to avoid a negative stimulus, and it can actually be quite strong and lasting, even in the absence of a negative stimulus. In avoidance learning, what's happening is you are, in your behavior, learning to avoid a negative stimulus. And so you have avoidance reinforcement. That negative stimulus never occurs because you have learned to avoid it. The consequence, therefore, in avoidance reinforcement is indirect. It amounts to consequence prevention, which, as you can see, is somewhat similar in the same family as negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is that negative stimulus removal, like that negative stimulus is being taken away. You had it, but it's taken away. But avoidance reinforcement is that negative stimulus never occurs. So I do my homework on time. I clean my room even before my mom brings it up or starts nagging about it. I know that negative consequence is possible, so I just do the behavior to avoid the negative stimulus at all. That's a special type of negative reinforcement called avoidance learning. Now, a weakness in avoidance learning is a special case called learned helplessness. In the case of learned helplessness, an animal actually does not learn to avoid negative outcomes because of being brought up in former experiences that had unavoidable negative experiences. We know about learned helplessness from a series of studies done by Seligman in the late and mid-1970s. In Seligman's experiments, what happened is he had dogs, and they were going to be reared in two very different environments. In one environment, they would be harnessed, and they would be harnessed in a room that had, on occasion, unpredictable, unavoidable shocks. The floor would electrify a little bit, creating an electrical current, and the current would be slightly painful. And since the dog was harnessed and raised in that environment, there was nothing that they could do to avoid the shock. So you had dogs that were reared in an unavoidably negative situation. They could not avoid the electric shock. Other dogs were reared in environments that didn't have any shock. They weren't harnessed. They didn't have any unavoidable, unpredictable electric shock situations. So you have one set of dogs reared in an unavoidably negative situation where they have no control over what happens. And you have other dogs raised in a situation that's somewhat normal and has some freedom. So when you put both dogs in a new situation, in this new situation, you're in a room and there is a floor, a regular floor. On occasion, the floor is going to electrify. So it's going to unpredictably create an electrical current. However, there is a gate that you can jump over to get to a box that's elevated, and the box does not light up. The box is like a safe zone. It is safe from electrical current. The dogs that were raised in a normal environment, when the electric shock comes, they learn to jump over the gate and they escape the shock. They go, this is not fun, so they learn to jump over the gate and escape the negative consequence. However, the dogs that were reared in the environment that was harnessed, the environment that did not have any ability to escape unpredictable negative consequence of shock, those dogs did not learn to jump the gate. They actually just laid down on the floor and took the shock, despite the fact that they could escape the shock. This is learned helplessness. So what's learned here is that the organism learns it has no control over negative consequence and negative outcomes. And everything it does, it didn't matter in the first place, so it just stops trying, even when they do have the ability to escape or they do have control to help the situation. So maybe you've asked this before, like, why is my friend in this abusive relationship? Why is my friend with this guy and it's not good? Why doesn't she leave? Why do people stay in abusive relationships? Or why does this happen? Or why does that happen? Sometimes people learn that they have no control. And if you've learned that you're helpless, it's very hard sometimes to, even when you do have control, feel like you have control and have ability to change the outcome. Learned helplessness, as you can imagine, has implications for depression and depressive thinking. Okay, so in this discussion of operant conditioning, we have to define some terms. And not all reinforcers are the same thing. So primary reinforcers are innately satisfying. They don't require any learning. You don't have to learn that they're pleasant or rewarding. Food, drink, pleasure, freedom from pain, those things are primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers, they become satisfying through experience and through association with a pre-existing reinforcer, and often a pre-existing primary reinforcer. So you have to learn or be conditioned with this reinforcer. It's linked to a primary one via classical conditioning. So an A on a report card might not be innately satisfying. But, so when I as a little kid get to learn that when I get an A and when my report card is really good, we get to take a trip to Cold Stone or to 31 Flavors, that grade is associated with a primary reinforcer, that's ice cream, right? That's food, it's sugar. You don't have to teach kids that sugar is satisfying. You don't have to teach adults that either. It becomes associated through classical conditioning. Now, these concepts of generalization, discrimination, extinction, and spontaneous recovery, all of them also take place in operant conditioning. So as much as we've seen it in classical conditioning, we also see the same things and the same concepts in operant conditioning. So extinction and spontaneous recovery are very, very similar to what happens with the extinction and spontaneous recovery in classical conditioning. In that sense, in operant conditioning, extinction is what happens when the behavior that you're doing decreases when the reinforcement or the goodies or the rewards stop. Spontaneous recovery is when a person will do that behavior again, like, is this going to work? Will I get the reward this time? That is very similar to what happens in classical conditioning. The difference, of course, is the learning in operant conditioning is between behavior and reinforcement, or behavior and punishment. Whereas in classical conditioning, the learned association is between two stimuli. In operant conditioning, generalization is what happens when that reinforced or rewarded behavior, it works in another context and another situation. So the stimulus in this case sets the occasion for the response. So therefore, in generalization, the responding occurs to similar stimuli. So a dog might learn a certain trick, and it gets a treat when it does a certain trick. Generalization would be if another person, somebody that has not been the one that's taught the trick, let's say that your friend comes over and you say, okay, go ahead and tell my dog to sit. When the dog sits to the friend's command, it has generalized the reinforcement to expect that it's going to get a treat or going to get praise from this other person as well as the primary person. It's generalized to similar stimuli. Discrimination in operant conditioning has to do with when the behavior will or will not be reinforced. So, do I get an ice cream trip for an A? Yes. Do I get an ice cream trip for a B? No. So when I learn to discriminate which behavior gets which reinforcement or lack of reinforcement, I learn to discriminate or specify which behavior to engage in. All of those concepts are absolutely carryovers from classical conditioning as well. Well, let me reinforce you for a second as we move on. We're going to go to the schedules of reinforcement. Hey guys, I'm so proud of you. I know that lectures are long, and I know that this chapter has a lot of terms to it. You're doing a great job, just a little bit more. Okay, so when we talk about schedules of reinforcement, your book notes that there's two types of reinforcement broadly, continuous and partial. In continuous reinforcement, every behavior is met with an instance of reinforcement or punishment. So every A equals an ice cream trip, every time. So people learn pretty quickly with continuous reinforcement because the behavior and reinforcement are continually having connections. Another type of learning has to do with partial reinforcement, when the behavior is sometimes rewarded or reinforced. And although a person might learn a little slower with partial reinforcement, oftentimes the behavior lasts longer. Oftentimes in partial reinforcement schedules, the behavior perseveres longer or remains longer because of the partial reinforcement schedule. Within partial reinforcement, there's going to be two broad types: ratio schedules and interval schedules. Ratio schedules are based on the number of behaviors that are performed in order to receive a reward. So in a ratio schedule, the thing that is determining the reward is the organism's behaviors, the number of times that they behave in a certain way. In an interval schedule, what's important is not the animal's behaviors per se, but the amount of time that goes by and the time that must elapse for a reward to be released. So ratio schedules have to do with number of behaviors contingent on reward, and interval schedules have to do with time contingent on reward. So let's talk about the ratio schedules. In a fixed ratio schedule, a reward will happen after a certain set of behaviors are conducted and done. So I have a picture here of a food dispenser, and let's imagine that you walk up there and you realize, okay, A2 is the Sour Patch Kids and E3 is the Cheez-Its. Let's see. If I want to get the Cheez-Its, I have to put in my money, that's a behavior, right? And I have to click a certain amount of buttons, E3. So the money plus E3 equals the Cheez-Its being deposited down at the bottom tray, which I get rewarded after I do a certain set of behaviors. An example of a fixed ratio schedule might be something like if you're a worker and you do a certain amount of papers, or you grade a certain amount of papers, or you do a certain amount of art pieces. If you get paid for every third art piece, that would be a fixed ratio. You're getting paid every third art piece. The payment is contingent on you doing 3 art pieces. Or if you're trying to teach a little kid to keep up on their homework and you have a homework chart at home, every day that they do their homework and they get a star sticker, every day that homework's done, they get the reward of the star sticker. That is fixed ratio. It's dependent on the kid's homework completion. In a variable ratio schedule, which is a special type of reinforcement schedule, you'll see very high and very steady rates of behavior from people and animals. This schedule actually is more resistant to extinction than the other 3 schedules. So in this schedule, reinforcement follows an unpredictable number of behaviors from the organism. So I have a picture here of a very classic variable ratio scenario, which is the slot machines or gambling. In a slot machine, there might be an average number of times that the slot machine pays out, but you don't know if it's going to be 1 quarter or it's going to be 100 quarters that leads you to the jackpot. Interestingly, things that are on a variable ratio schedule will often promote a lot of behaving from people. So if I don't know quite when the reward is going to come, I'm going to just keep doing it. And slot machines are really, really high earners, very, very high earners for casinos, because people will sit there for a very long time and they will keep doing the behavior, putting those coins in one after the other. So which coin is it going to be? Which behavior, which time is it going to be? The jackpot's just around the corner. Is it this one? Is it this next one? Is it this one? Is it this one? So in variable ratio, you're going to see a high, steady rate of behavior from the organism, and that behavior is going to be somewhat hard to extinguish. So people are going to sit at that slot machine for a long time. Okay, let's talk about the interval schedules. So in the fixed interval schedule, that reinforcement or reward follows a behavior that has occurred after a set amount of time has elapsed. This pattern, as you're going to see on the next slide, follows this little scalloped pattern of responding, where people will, as the time approaches, they'll increase the behavior towards it because they can anticipate that the time or the interval, the fixed interval, is coming close to time. I have an example of somebody checking their mail. So in this picture, you'll see a guy is checking his mailbox, and mail comes once a day, right? You might check it several times a day before it comes, but after it comes, a person stops responding because it has come for that day. It's not coming again. So that's the scallop in the responding chart, that as it gets close to time where the mail might come, an organism might check a few times, but after they have the reinforcement, they have their mail with them, they know that the mail's not going to come again today because mail only comes a certain amount of times. I have it for the day. I don't need to keep looking. I don't need to keep checking. So what's another example of fixed interval? Well, you know that you have exams at certain weeks and certain times in class. You have them on this week, and here's finals week. In your calendar, you can see those are the exams. That's where they come. That's where they're going to come in the timeline. Fixed interval would mean that you often increase your studying and your behavior right before the exam. And when the exam has completed, you often stop studying for that exam because you just did it, right? So that's that scalloped pattern of responding for the fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Another interval schedule of reinforcement is the variable interval schedule. In that schedule, reinforcement follows behavior that occurs after an unpredictable amount of time has elapsed. So let's imagine that you have pop quizzes in my class and not preset exam times. They're not fixed exam times. At variable, random, unpredictable times, there's going to be pop quizzes. In a variable interval schedule, you'll often see slow and somewhat consistent behavior and responding because the person is always sort of in a state of readiness, preparedness, and getting ready for the potential reward or outcome. I have a picture of a person fishing here, and people that fish, they know that it's variable. You could catch one fish immediately, or you could spend the whole day doing that and not catch a single fish. So the person that's fishing will often be fishing for a while because they don't know if they'll catch a fish in 5 minutes or 5 hours. As you can see, the schedules of reinforcement have different levels of responding and different types of responding. It's important for you to come up with examples for each of them. I think when you come up with examples, you can understand a chart like this more successfully. So let's just walk this through. Fixed ratio might be a kid getting a star sticker for every homework that they get done. They get their homework done and they get a sticker. And it is a high level of responding because it's specific and it's based on their behavior, their fixed number of behaviors. That growth happens at a fixed amount. Every 3 art pieces equals a payday. And so you'll see 3 art pieces equals payday. So there's a fixed amount of behaviors that lead to responses. High level of responding. In variable ratio, we could get reinforced on our first quarter in the slot machine, or it could be 100 quarters in before the jackpot takes place. And since that is the case, we're going to keep responding and sort of stay in the chair and keep putting those quarters in the slot machine because the payout could come at any time. Also a very high level of responding, very slow to extinguish that behavior. In fixed interval, we're going to study for the test, and once the test happens, we sort of taper off on our studying, and we amp back up the next time there's a test, and we know where it is. We know it's a fixed amount of time. That's the next test. And then after we have the test, we amp our behaviors down a little bit, so it has a scalloped responding rate. And for variable interval, since we get reinforced at a random and unpredictable amount of time that goes by, we just need to be slow, steady, and somewhat consistent in responding because the reinforcement could come at any time. That pop quiz could be today or it could be next week. So I better study either way. I could catch that fish right now, or it might be 4 hours from now, so I better stay in the water. Okay, we're still talking about operant conditioning, but I want to talk about punishment now. Punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening. And punishment, therefore, is a consequence that decreases the likelihood that a behavior will occur. There is a reduction in the behavior because of unpleasant consequences. There are two types of punishment: positive punishment and negative punishment. Again, just like reinforcement, we see that positive and negative don't mean good and bad. Positive means the addition of something, and negative means the subtraction or removal of something. So let's talk about positive punishment and negative punishment. So an aversive or unpleasant stimulus is added in positive punishment. So when a parent scolds a child or says no, or is scolding or negative in their tone, they are adding an unpleasant scolding. That is the addition of an unpleasant stimulus. In negative punishment, behavior is also followed by an aversive consequence, something that's unpleasant. But in this case, what is negative or taken away is a rewarding stimulus, or something that's good is removed. And if you remove something that I like, that's unpleasant, right? So if you remove my ability to play video games, or you remove my gaming system from my bedroom, you are removing something rewarding, therefore that is punishment. And that is negative punishment. So positive punishment could be something like the addition of chores, the addition of having to write sentences, the addition of having to do a task that you don't like. And in positive punishment, this means that something unpleasant is being added to the scenario. Negative punishment is stuff like timeouts, right? So when you take a kid from what they're doing, they're playing, and you put them on timeout, they can't talk, they can't play, they have to sit there in the corner and reflect. You're removing them from the pleasant playtime or the pleasant situation or the freedom that they had. You're removing the pleasant freedom. That is a rewarding stimulus being removed. So a timeout is a good example of a negative punishment. Being grounded, or having a restriction, or having your cell phone or your Xbox, or having something that's important, your car keys, taken away or grounded for a while or restricted for a while, that would be negative punishment. It is the removal of something that you enjoy. If you remove something I enjoy, that is a punishment, right? So punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior occurring or reoccurring. So let's do an example here. And in this example, we have a person with their friends in the new car because they just got a driver's license, and they're showing off to their friends by speeding. So it's just like exciting. This is the behavior, the speeding in the car behavior. In this example, positive punishment would be getting pulled over and scolded by the police officer. Ticketed, scolded, you're in trouble. That's the addition of a scolding, the addition of a discipline, the addition of a correction. In regard to negative punishment, the person might lose something that they like, a rewarding stimulus that they like, which is $550 to pay the speeding ticket. It is the removal of something they enjoy, which is money. That would be negative punishment. So I have on this slide also negative reinforcement. So let's imagine you're showing off by speeding, but someone that's behind you is tailgating you a lot. And you speed up to escape this tailgating. Tailgating is negative. It's a negative experience. And when you speed up, you take the tailgating away. tailgating is something negative in the sense that you don't enjoy it. And so when you take away something aversive, it reinforces the behavior, right? It rewards you for avoiding that tailgating. That could be negative reinforcement. Now, positive reinforcement could be, for example, and I don't have it on this slide, but if your friends in your car give you a lot of praise and a lot of like, whoa, you're so cool, fast and furious. Like if, I don't know why I said that. But if your friends really give you praise for speeding and showing off, that could be positive reinforcement. So one behavior could have both reinforcing and punishing consequences. So we've talked about the two types of associative learning. We talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Your book also talks about another type of learning, and that is observational learning. It is the learning that occurs when a person observes and imitates the behavior or models the behavior of other creatures around them. A name that we have that's important for observational learning is Albert Bandura. Bandura is really well known for a study called the Bobo doll experiment. In the Bobo doll experiment, these Bobo dolls are essentially inflatable clown-looking things. It's kind of like a cone-shaped inflatable doll. It has a weight, a lead weight on the bottom. So like if you punch it or kick it, it'll tilt back, but because of the lead weight on the bottom, it'll ballast itself back to center. So, you can interact with it in that way. In the Bobo doll experiment, children watched one of two different conditions with the Bobo doll. They either watched an adult playing with the Bobo doll in a very aggressive way, kicking, punching, hugging, like aggressively hugging and like throwing it around, or they observed the adult essentially ignoring the doll and not being violent with it. When kids that had observed adult actors that were violent, when kids watched that and then were released to go play with the Bobo doll, those children were more aggressive with the Bobo doll than were the children that did not have any vicarious or observational learning of watching an adult engage with the Bobo doll in an aggressive way. This is the foundation of observational learning. To Bandura, there are 4 processes, and you will see that these 4 processes overlap with where we're going in our next chapter, which is chapter 7, memory. A little side note here, the reason that I've done chapter 6 and 7 together instead of going to 5 first is that I feel like it's really important for you to connect the pieces of learning and memory together before we can go into other actions in this unit. The 4 processes of observational learning, according to Bandura, are attention. That means that you're focused on what's happening and you can see what's going on. You're watching the adult kick the Bobo doll. You're paying attention to it. That's process 1. Process 2 is retention, which is essentially remembering by the time you get in the room with the Bobo doll. You remember what the adult had done with it previously, and that is retention or memory. The third process is motor reproduction. So if you've attended to an adult kicking this Bobo doll, this inflatable doll, and you remember when you get in the room with the Bobo doll that that adult behaved in that way, motor reproduction would be that you too try to kick and punch and bring that Bobo doll to the ground, like wrestle it down. And the fourth process has to do with reinforcement. And that reinforcement very much can be vicarious reinforcement in the sense that you can watch other people and see whether or not they got rewarded or punished. In the case of the Bobo doll, reinforcement could be vicarious by way of, well, I watched these adults play with the doll and they were really rough with the doll and nothing bad happened to the adult. Like the adult wasn't scolded, the adult wasn't taken away from the toy, there was no punishment. So reinforcement then can be another process of observational learning. Because if certain people get away with certain actions, even if we don't personally get away with it, if we see other people getting away with certain things, it is vicariously reinforcing. Those are the 4 processes of observational learning. Your chapter also has some really cool connections to the cognitive perspective of learning. And cognition is something that we're going to talk even deeper about in Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, you're going to see some of the connection points between this chapter, Chapter 6, and the cognitive chapter, Chapter 8. So what I'd like you to do is please especially take note of latent learning, that is the maze with Tolman, as well as insight learning that we have from our Gestalt psychologist Kohler that was working with chimpanzees in the Cayman Islands during World War I. Your book also has some really neat things to say about some of the biological, cultural, and psychological constraints of learning that I think are worthy of reflection and discussion. And also at the end of this chapter, every chapter ends with a discussion, a broader discussion of what these concepts mean for health and wellness. We see that these animal models lead us to many insights about the factors that influence the degree of stress that we're under. Now, I can guarantee that if you're listening to this lecture right now, you're in a week of school in which there's probably many demands on your system, many stressors, many things that you're thinking about, many things that you're concerned about. So this might be particularly relevant for you to refer to. So what are some factors that influence the degree of stress that you experience? Well, people are often less stressed if they have predictable stressors versus unpredictable stressors. Now, you might not be able to predict when stress will hit, but you do know when you have exams, you do know when you have assignments due. So in regard to some of your stressors, there are some that are predictable. People often feel less stress and less effect of stress under situations of predictable stress rather than unpredictable stress. This connects with control. People that have some degree of control over the stressor experience less severe stress. So you might not be able to control every life situation going on around you. But you can control whether or not you study tonight or study tomorrow or get ahead on your materials. You can control your calendar, your time, and how much time on YouTube you spend or how much time you spend on your phone or social media. You can control some part of the stressors that you experience. People often feel less stressed when they feel improvement or reduction in the amount of stress, even if it just goes from very bad to bad. They would prefer to go from very bad stress down to just bad average stress than to go from no stress to bad stress. So what you need to try to do, therefore, is try to reduce your stress. You try to create more predictable, more controllable situations that reduce your stress even just a little bit. Even if you can take it from a 10 to a 9 on the scale of 10, if you can reduce it a little bit, this is good for you. Move in the direction of improvement. It'll make a big difference. And also, as you move in the direction of improvement, you need to find outlets to have self-care and outlets to share your frustration and outlets to know that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. So let your professor say something kind to you for just a second. You're doing an awesome job. You're okay. Just one little task at a time. You're going to be okay. You're not alone in this. We're all learning together. We're all challenged together. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and we can grow from those things. Be brave, be diligent, keep trying. All right, brave ones, on that note, I'm just so proud of you. Thank you so much for being courageous and diligent and hardworking, focused and kind and caring. I hope that this chapter revealed things to you about how you learn and how the people and animals around you learn. I also hope that out of the insights of this chapter, you've learned something that's going to make you more effective in university life. You've learned something that's going to help you later. This chapter absolutely connects with our next chapter. Our next chapter is on human memory, and learning and memory go hand in hand. And all in all, I want to remind you that you're doing it and you can do it. So have an awesome week. I'm proud of you. Good job.